1979, I heard a record of Bottesini by somebody, and I said to my wife, I said, who gave me the record, I said, that's okay. I said, I think I could do better than that. Then she threw down the gauntlet. She said, why don't you?
Welcome back to another episode of Contrabass Conversations, your show covering life on the low end of the spectrum. I'm your host, Jason Heath, and I want to thank you so much for tuning in. Subscribe to the podcast, share us on social media, and drop us a line. I'd love to hear from you. Details to everything are available at our website, contrabassconversations.com. So today, we are featuring Thomas Martin, who's one of the true legends of the double bass, and is somebody that I've been looking forward to having on the show for quite some time. Now, Tom has worn many hats throughout his career, from working as a principal bassist in major orchestras worldwide, and as a soloist who championed the music of Bottesini, as a luthier, as a teacher, and even as a conductor. He's had a lasting impact in the bass world, and I know you're going to love this episode. Tom and I dig into a wide variety of topics, including his early years, playing in the Army Orchestra, studying with Roger Scott, the process of uncovering the music of Bottesini, and how Tom reconstructed the way that Bottesini actually approached the instrument. Tom's experiences making basses and the bass revolution that's happening right now. You'll be hearing a few excerpts of Tom performing Bottesini during this episode, and you can find links to his 5 volumes of Bottesini recordings in the show notes. And after the interview, we've got some news, feedback, and housekeeping, so stay tuned for that after this conversation with Thomas Martin. Let everybody know what your first musical instrument was.
Yeah, the piano, like everybody. But, and I wish I'd kept it up, I can tell you. But I think I was mildly dyslexic when they didn't know what it was. And so both hands together was a bit of a little bit of a project sometimes. So when I was 12, I went to junior high school, and our music teacher, who was an American Indian, a lovely guy, he had 2 shiny new double basses in there, and he said, I've got 2 new double basses. Who wants to try these? So my little hand went up. And that was it. They had fixed end pins. They were king basses, plywood things.
Sure.
They had a German bow and a fixed end pin. So I ended up standing on Cincinnati telephone directories. And I thought I would continue growing, but Mother Nature's cruel. I didn't. So there you are. Yeah. Then after about a year, I took myself off to the local conservatory, and I said, I want to learn the double bass. And my parents didn't know anything about this. I took myself off there. They said, we have 2 teachers. One plays the French bow and one plays the German bow. So I was already playing the German bow, so I said, well, I'll have that one. And this Mr. Roberts, who was a wonderful, wonderful first teacher. His teacher had studied with Siemendel.
Oh, okay.
So it was a straight line back to the real school. And I can still do both bows, which I'm very grateful for. And, it was very, very good time. I was able to go to Eastman for a year. Mm-hmm. And my father was against my going into music. He was a lawyer. So you can imagine in those days you had to be nuts to go into music. So I did. And I got into Eastman with Oscar Zimmerman. And it was okay. I changed to French bow while I was with Oscar. He said, you're not getting enough sound out of the E string. He was right. So I said, yeah, I think you're right. He said, you should change to French bow. I said, well, what do I do? He said, go get a French bow. I got a French bow, and he came in. I said, now what do I do? He was such a natural player. He just said, well, you just grab it and play. He said. So I had to go to all my colleagues and say, what do I do? What do I do with this thing? They said, well, we think you put your thumb here and your first finger there, and they were telling me. I didn't really kind of have a consistent bow arm, but then I wanted to go. I'd been accepted at Curtis, and I wanted to go to Curtis again. So I wrote him again when I was 19, and they said, "Oh yes, you can come." And Easton wouldn't let me go.
Really?
Yeah, they found some archaic thing where you couldn't go from one school on scholarship to another school on scholarship. Anyway, there happened to be a job in nearby Buffalo Philharmonic. And although I was just a kid, I thought, well, I'm going to have a go. Maybe I'll get a job, and then that'll fix things for a while. And I went there, and this big fellow with googly eyes was at the audition. He said, "You're very young. What are you doing here?" I told him the whole story. I didn't know any better. I told him the whole story, and he said, "Don't worry, I'll be your education." And it was Joseph Krips, one of the greatest of all the Viennese conductors, who was the music director, and he took me under his wing. And every week he was there. He was the principal conductor of the London Symphony at the same time, and he made a fantastic Beethoven cycle. But every week he was there, about 20 weeks out of 25-week season. I used to go and play to him, and he'd tell me all about the composers and all about, music and how to play. And it was the best thing that ever happened to me.
Yeah.
He was just wonderful.
Tom spent time playing in the Tommy Dorsey Orchestra, and around that time his draft papers arrived. Now, Hal Espinosa, the longtime Los Angeles trumpet player, let Tom know about the Army Orchestra.
Hal said, I think they've got a symphony orchestra that travels in Europe, and if you give them an extra year, you can get in there. And I heard that Larry Hurst and Marvin Topolsky and some other people had already been in it. It was based in Stuttgart. I thought, wow. Maybe I can learn something and keep learning and stuff like that. So, and play in the symphony orchestra. So we were playing at Fort Knox, I remember, and I went and auditioned for the bandmaster. He said, "Yeah, you're good enough." He said, "I'll recommend you." So I got my military occupational specialty before I went in. And so anyway, I got all through basic training. I thought, now these guys are going to be surprised when they say special bandsman. They didn't. They said advanced infantry. I thought, what? These big farm boys are finally going to kill me. So, and I couldn't figure. So I went to the lawyer, and he said, the Army lawyer. He said, "Well, look," he said, "you can get out if they don't give you that specialty. You're out." So anyway, I ended up going to a naval school of music in Washington for a little while, and then I ended up in the Army band. They didn't have an opening, but I could play bass guitar and bass and no music and whatever. So I went to see the sergeant. I said, "Sergeant, I want to play better." He said, "That's what we like to hear. You choose a teacher, and we'll sort it out." So I thought, I'm going to cheek it. This is my one chance. I said, "I picked Mr. Roger Scott at the Curtis Institute of Music." He laughed. He said, "Yeah, I like you, kid." He said, "I'll fix it." And he did.
Wow.
Yeah. So I had free time. I had free time every week to go and study. It was just absolutely, it was fairy tale.
No kidding. What a great way to end up studying with Roger Scott.
Exactly. And Oscar was such a natural. He was a Torella student, but Oscar was such a natural. And he went from a 15-year-old trumpet player to 19 years old in the Philadelphia Orchestra with Stokowski. And he learned all the musical stuff, but he just had a natural technique. Mm-hmm. He learned a bit, but he couldn't put it across the way Roger could, who had to work for it. And the result from working for it was that he knew everything.
He must have been such a fantastic, what a legendary teacher. What were lessons with him like?
Oh, well, they used to go on, because he only had about 4 students, they used to go on for hours. Sometimes, he would listen to every note you prepared. And if it was a series of arpeggios and scales and intervals and everything like that, bowings and whatever, he'd listen to every note. He'd occasionally pick up the bass, like I teach with a bass. He didn't. He used to have a cup of tea and stuff while we sweated away. And but he'd occasionally pick up the bass, and you'd think, "Oh my golly, the guy could really play."
Yeah.
He wasn't primarily interested in soloism, but I don't think I've ever heard a better orchestral bass player than that. He was absolutely fantastic. And of course, in those days, I'm talking the early 60s. Of course, we had gut strings. We didn't have anything else, so it was all on gut strings.
Wow.
Yeah, and he was a very reserved person, but he was just a wonderful teacher. I think all of his students had some kind of success or another. And the Torello school really works.
So everybody was playing on gut strings at that point. That's right. I forget.
Oh, if you came in with a metal string, he'd throw you out. I think some of the orchestras, notably Boston were playing on metal strings. But they found some kind of strings, I don't know what, called black diamond or something, which was sort of solid core guitar type strings. How they played on them, I didn't know. But I mean, Kuzovitsky had 5 French bass players in there, and they had a different sort of idea, a different sound.
So you're playing on gut strings at that point, and when did you move over to steel strings?
1971. Yeah, and I started in 1952. So what's that? That's nearly, 20 years or something. You think back was ridiculous because we, I did auditions and recitals and concertos and everything else, with gut strings, because that's what there was. Some guys were just starting to use steel strings in the sort of late 50s and through the 60s. 2 big orchestras that changed from gut very late. That was Philadelphia and Berlin. Not everybody could play on a gut string. Mm-hmm. So a lot of people actually just couldn't play the bass. And the other side is that you'd have sort of inexpensive German basses that sold for big money. Everybody was trying to buy old, Louis what's-his-name's bass because it sounded terrific. And you could have first-rate beautiful Italian basses that nobody would buy because they didn't sound well with the gut strings. And the metal string has made almost every instrument accessible and playable. Yeah, I think Gary came out with a solo record and shook us all up. We thought, hey, we can do this. And then the steel string came along, which, as I say, made the bass accessible to everyone, and people could play the bass, and any bass was approachable, and anybody could play the bass. It wasn't like that before. And so I think the development and the evolution of the steel string is solely responsible for this huge what would you call it? It's not a revolution or anything, but it's this huge change in bass playing that's happened during my lifetime.
Yeah, no, it kind of is a revolution. And yeah, you've been from on the cusp of it all the way through it.
Well, I've tried anyway. I'm trying to keep up.
Well, I love this image of you standing on phone books playing a King bass.
Yeah, King Moretone bass it was called.
Oh, wow. What was your progression of different bass? Because I mean, obviously you're known as a bass maker too, and you know so much about the bass. What were those next few instruments like for you?
The King bass belonged to the high school, and my parents didn't know I was doing the bass, so I went home for summer break with this bass. And then I signed myself up for these lessons at the conservatory, and then my teacher said, "You really should get a bass." So we went to see a fella who lived in my town in Cincinnati. He was doing a master's degree on the GI Bill. And he took the money from our first double bass purchase, $350, and went down and paid the rent on the bass vol shop. And that was the first specialist shop in double basses, I think, in the U.S.
Yeah.
There's a fellow named Harold Carnes in Chicago and Paul Tenegas in Los Angeles that did violins, but also basses. And Dave Horine began this bass vol shop, which was huge. And I sort of became the mascot. I used to go down and sweep the floor after school sometimes and on Saturdays. And I got to meet all these bass players, and the legendary people would come in like Ray Brown, and my gosh. And I got to meet them, and I got to see what the inside of a bass looked like. And different basses, and this is Italian, and that's German, and why, and stuff like that. So I think that started it. That started the ball rolling on interest in double basses. Then I had, what is my next bass? I had the bass was a beautiful Czech bass that ended up the property of Dennis Knight. And Dennis very sadly died, and the bass sort of disappeared. I don't know where it is. My next bass was an American bass by Gemunder, who were makers in New York, German people that settled in New York, 1880 something, I think it was. Had quite a hard sound. I kept that for a while. Then I bought a Bottesini from Gerald Fiore, who was principal in the Metropolitan Opera. And my first teacher admired him and knew of him. And whenever I was in New York on the band for a couple of weeks, I'd go have a bass lesson. And one day, he was 82. It's a funny story. He was 82. It's why we were having lunch in New Rochelle in his place. And Mrs. Fiore came out. I can still, cottage cheese and peach salad. And she went berserk. She said, "What are you doing? You're 82. You're going to play in the opera every night." She said, "Your family's on the West Coast." She went wild. I didn't know I was going to hide under the table. I thought it's going to be. But anyway, he listened to all this tirade. He thought for a minute. He said, "You're right. I quit." And he went and phoned up and said, "I quit." He said, "Martin, you want my bass?" I said, "Well, gosh." I said, "I can't afford it." He said, $900.
Oh, wow.
It was a Bottesini. It belonged to Umberto Boldrini, who was the principal bass under Mahler, you know. Anyway, so I bought this bass. I phoned up Jane Dorsey, who sent the band bus and $900. And I got this bass. It was good, but it wasn't great. And anyway, but I didn't know any better. Then I saw another bass at Fantoni's shop that I really should have bought. It was a Marchetti. It sounded better. But this bass was okay. It sounded all right. And that got me through for a bit. I spent most of my career on a Vincenzo Toneh bass in the orchestra. But I had quite a nice Italian solo bass by Bergonzi that I used. And now I play on Martins.
No, well, what else would you play on? That's
well,
great.
I don't know. I mean, there's a couple of nice ones. I've got an orchestra bass and a solo bass, and they're sounding better and better, and I'm happy. That's fine.
You've had such a long career in orchestras, with everything that you've done overseas and in London and Montreal. And at what point did you start to develop your solo career? If you're like I ended up being like a principal bass player. Yeah.
And my teacher thought that's what I should have been. Mm-hmm. So he started helping me to go in that way. And lo and behold, I went over to the Israel Philharmonic as number 2. And then I went to Montreal as number 1. And that's been my job, orchestral principal, all these years.
Tom and I go on to talk about his experiences discovering the music of Bottesini. Tom discovered 2 steamer trunks filled with Bottesini's music, and he convinced the conservatory in Parma to put this music on their shelves.
But then years later, sort of 1979, I heard a record of Bottesini by somebody, and I said to my wife, who gave me the record, I said, that's okay. I said, I think I could do better than that. Then she threw down the gauntlet. She said, "Why don't you?" I mean, I did some solos. I did like most principal players ended up playing a concerto and whatever have you.
Yeah.
I thought, well, how do I start with this Bottesini thing? I became very interested. And this was the most fascinating and enjoyable time in my life. I had a change of life. I could practice at home. Yeah, I couldn't practice for 16 years. I used to start World War III, about why do you practice the violin and all this stuff. So, but I mean, then I had encouragement. I thought, well, why don't I try and play some Bottesini? I thought, if you buy a washing machine, you read the manual. I had Bottesini's original method book for 3-string bass and writing and everything in it, and it's been reorganized unsuccessfully a few times since then, I think. But and they changed all the keys and stuff. But I got the book out. I ruined Christmas in 79. I went through every note with every fingering, and he played with his hand closed. He played 1/4 with his finger in the lower register.
Really? Huh.
Yeah. He played 1/4 for semitones and 1/4 for tones. It was the old Lombard school. Anyway, you know, because I mean, he studied in the 1830s, and some of the Italian schools, you know, they had big long necks in Milan, so they all played with their hands closed or open. It was 1/4 or 1/4 for a semitone or a tone. And then I read every word. I read the whole thing. By the time I finished this book, it goes into solo playing and stuff like that in the end. By the time I finished the book, I was a changed man. And Torello, you know, that line goes right back to Bottesini anyway.
Yeah.
So I knew a lot of the things in principle, but it was very interesting to. And then I thought, I'm going to get every piece I can find, and we found some pieces since then, of course. But I got every piece I could find, and I thought, well, I'll go through all these pieces and see what happens. I never dreamt to play any of that stuff in public. The whole exercise was about figuring out how Bottesini played the bass, because the other people that were trying to do Bottesini, notably Streicher, who's a nice guy and became a very good friend of mine. Streicher played how he played, but he played Bottesini, and he could play it. But I thought, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to try and figure how Bottesini played the bass. And in the end, I did, because all the pieces showed me. You know, I reconstructed the technique backwards from the pieces. And then I was in the English Chamber Orchestra then for a while. We were on tour nonstop. And so the horn player played the piano very well. Yeah, we used to practice in the afternoons and stuff and all this Bottesini music. And after a while, he said, you're getting good at this stuff. He said, why don't we record some of this? And that started the recordings in the early 80s. And then I guess I made the last record with Franco Petracchi in the LSO. That must have been in the late 90s. Then the last Bottesini record I made was Bottesini's Requiem, which is a wonderful piece.
What was that like conducting that piece? Was that your first time?
Yeah, I'd never conducted before, but I knew that the project was coming. Naxos helped me, and because the other records were with Naxos, and so I really wanted to do this. It was a dream, one of my dreams, and because the piece is so beautiful, I thought that people need to hear this. So we had this project. And I had 2 years of very regular and intensive study of conducting.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I really worked hard at it. And in the end, I could do it. So I thought, well, okay, let's go.
That's great. Well, what a nice feeling spending all those years in the back of the orchestra in the bass section. All of a sudden, there you are up front.
There are a load of students. The bass section in the LPO, they're all students.
Oh, that's great.
I felt right at home, and I even gave an extra double bass, so we had 5 basses and 6 cellos, just so we'd have an extra one of my students would participate.
You know, I've read through your Bottesini, that great article, that In Search of Bottesini that you've got, and it's interesting. I mean, it's such a massive work of Bottesini scholarship. It was fun to read about Cuba and his experiences in Havana and all that.
Got interested. This was the same time I was studying all the pieces. You know, I got interested, and everywhere we went on tour, I'd go Bottesini hunting, and very often I'd find him.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah. So I ended up specializing in Bottesini, I guess.
When did you were working in the Cincinnati, the bass viol shop, helping out, when did you actually start making your own basses?
Not for years. About the same time I started with the Bottesini practicing, I took violin making lessons. There's a very, very fine violin maker who was teaching in Cremona, an Englishman, and he moved back to England. I did private lessons. It was very expensive. Top fiddle maker. He's now vice president of one of the most successful violin shops in the United States. He married a girl that owned the shop. He's in Minneapolis.
Oh, okay.
Claire Givens Violins. He's the vice president. Andrew Dipper. He's fantastic. Yeah. Looking back, he told me everything of the classical violin making. I used to help, of course, grunt it a bit occasionally to know what models to make and stuff in Germany. And we'd finish a tour, and I'd nip over there and mess around. And one day he said, look, if you made a bass, what would you make? So I said, I don't know. So I drew one, and he said, well, I've got a table joined up. Let's go. So I started. And then I came back and sort of started, I'd make maybe 2 a year, which just corresponded with tax bill time.
Okay.
And I left the LSO in 97 because they said you all have to retire when you're 65. Well, I was 57. So I thought, I asked Janice, what do I do? She said, leave now. So you've got something developed to when you're 65. She was smart. She is smart. So we moved out to the country. We had some horses and stuff. We moved out to the country, and I started making more basses. I took on a helper, and we used to make one a month.
Mm-hmm. Wow, one a month.
Yeah, instead of 1 or 2 a year. And I still did playing, but it was primarily making instruments then. So a lot of instruments that I made came from that period. I mean, the one I play in orchestra is something like 18 years old, which was from that time. Then later on, gradually, I kept being very busy playing and running around and teaching stuff, and then my son is sort of running that side of it now. There's a workshop with 4 people plus my son.
Well, it's got to be so interesting getting into that whole process of making basses. Do you think that that's changed the way you approach your playing on the bass, spending all this time constructing basses? Has that changed you as a player?
No, but being a player was arguably a good player. That really, really affected how I made an instrument. Being a bass player was a huge help. A lot of them know how to make, but they don't know what to make. And now every time you turn a corner, there's a bass luthier there. That seems to be, everybody's making basses now, but didn't used to be. And that's made a huge change, because when I was, say even 20 years ago, if somebody came in with a non-English or Italian bass in the section, I would say, look, get that out of here. Get yourself a good bass. And now, some of these instruments are very good. And so the modern instrument, as the old instruments have left the ability of the player to purchase, new instruments have become, or modern instruments have become acceptable. Well, they weren't before. So, it's only the finest orchestras do you have a section full of really good double basses. And then you've got sort of good modern ones. And there's some not very good modern ones, but there were some not very good old ones as well. So there you go. But I mean, there's a lot more good instruments now available to the player. A lot of them are modern. Then you had the Romanians, and then latterly the Chinese entered the market as well. So it's become pretty well saturated.
And it's part of that whole bass revolution you were talking about. It's like with.
That's right. Yes, it's absolutely. It's very interesting. It's a terribly interesting time to be alive and be a bass player.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And the techniques are getting bigger and bigger and bigger because the basses are more and more accessible. And, metal strings and et cetera, low actions, and away you go.
You also do a lot of teaching, and you still do a lot of teaching these days. It's amazing to me how you're balancing the performing you're doing and the teaching, and it's pretty impressive to keep all of those balls in the air.
Well, you're very sweet. I've got, it's about keeping the wolf from the door, really. That's what it's about. I love work. I think the best thing you can do ever is work with a young musician.
Yeah.
To help a young musician, or especially to work with a young musician. I think that's the greatest thing you can do, is to keep our profession and keep our instrument going. And I've had a very, very good class over the years, I have to say. Most of the principals around in the UK and people in front of the orchestras are old students, and a lot of them around the world. So I'm just thrilled. I'm thrilled with that. I've got a class now. Next year it'll be 20 up in Birmingham. I left the Royal College in London and went up to Birmingham. So when the students go out and succeed, that's my reward.
Thanks again, Tom, for the great interview. And folks, you can learn more about Tom and his many ventures by visiting his website, thomasmartin.co.uk. Okay, we've got some news, feedback, housekeeping details, that sort of thing. So we're going with that. First of all, I've been searching for other podcasters like me, people that are in this cultural arts podcasting world. I don't know what you would call it. And I have found some. There are not very many, but there are a few, and I wanted to let you know about them. And I'm putting links to these in the show notes. There are 4 that I think you all would like to check out. And here they are. The first one is The Entrepreneurial Musician with Andrew Hitz. Andrew and I went to Northwestern together years and years ago. And I just got interviewed on this podcast too, which is very cool. So I'll link up to that when it comes out. But I've been having such a good time following along with this podcast. He does a great job. And he's had 2 Contrabass Conversations guests on recently. So he had Peter Seymour, and then his very first guest was Renan Meyer. And he just came out of the gate running great podcasts. It's really fantastic. I would highly recommend this. Link in the show notes. Check it out. Another podcast I've discovered recently is with a bass trombonist in New York City called Divergent Paths. Dan Dunford is the host. And it's kind of hitting on similar topics. There are a few of these entrepreneurial musician type of podcasts, I guess that might be a genre that's starting to emerge. And Dan's is kind of along those lines, but it's very fun. He's a great host. Check it out. I've enjoyed the guests that he's had on, and he's doing it weekly too. Andrew's is weekly as well. Oh, another thing, the Entrepreneurial Musician. Andrew does kind of a cool thing where he puts an episode out one week, and then the next week he does a 5 to 8 minute kind of major lessons learned recap of the previous podcast. And I haven't really seen people do that before, but I love the model. It's very cool. I'd love to do that for this, but I'm already putting out a lot of podcasts. I don't want to muddy the waters too much with lots of extra podcasts for you to click through and kind of get confused where the meat is. So, but I like that model a lot. So if you check out Andrew's podcast, definitely check out what he's doing there. 2 other podcasts that I really dig, Clarinet. And I realize maybe not a lot of you are super wanting to dig into all the nitty gritty on clarinet. But Sean Perrin's podcast, Clarinet, is really great. And it's not just about geeking out on clarinet, although there is that. He does a fantastic job hosting that. Great guests, interesting stuff, fairly new podcast. And then the last one is Hugh Sung's podcast, A Musical Life, which I was interviewed for maybe a month or 2 ago now at this point. And then I just interviewed Hugh for Contrabass Conversations. I realized this is an interesting person. I typically have bass players on, not always though, and I think you all will love hearing from Hugh. Mark Ramirez passed along a link to me recently for a GoFundMe for a bassist named Cassie LaMarche. And she's trying to raise funds to go to Prague in September. And I'll read what she wrote briefly on her GoFundMe. She says, "Hello, everyone. I'm Cassie LaMarche. I'm a current student at the University of Minnesota, Duluth. And I'm studying music performance on my favorite instrument, the double bass. I've been playing the bass since I was in 6th grade after switching from the viola. Since then, I've played in various chamber orchestras, pit orchestras, symphonic orchestras, and jazz ensembles. And during my senior year of high school, I received a National Orchestra Award for my dedication to the high school orchestra and my instrument. Recently, I was awarded with a wonderful opportunity. Tomastic Strings selected me to be one of 2 promotion girls to attend and work at Bass 2016 Prague. It is a bass conference in Prague, Czech Republic, where hundreds of the world's best bassists will meet up, learn, and perform with each other. And this is, in Jason's words for a second, I did an interview with Ursula Diedrich Peterson. If you haven't checked that out, it was a few weeks ago about all the details of Prague 2016. So check that out. So even though I've been working extremely hard with my 2 jobs this summer, there's no way I can make enough money to pay for the ticket by myself. Thus, I'm asking for some help. I have a very short amount of time to raise this money. I leave for the conference on September 19th, and I'm there until the 26th. So any donation will help. And if you do decide to donate, thank you very much in advance. I will personally handwrite a thank you card if you do donate. And a little more on the page. check it out. There's a link in the show notes. Obviously, I'd love to see Cassie make it to Prague. So if you can chip in a few bucks for her, go for it. That's great. And thanks, Mark, for passing that along. Guy Toneh, a podcast favorite, he's been on the show a few times, is going to be in the States doing some master classes. He's actually going to be in Chicago in September, which is kind of a bummer for me because now I'm out here on the West Coast. I'd love to see Guy live. Now, he'll be in Chicago the 16th and the 17th for a masterclass and concert. And on the 24th, he'll be doing a masterclass, I believe, with Diana Gannett in Chicago. I will get you more details on that as they become available. I'm going to Skype with Guy in the next few days, so we'll find out more about that soon. But that's very cool. A couple more bits of listener feedback. John Clear from Acadiana University in Louisiana wanted to let everybody know about Louisiana Bass Fest. It happens every year at Louisiana State University around February or March and is totally free to attend. And there is a solo competition, and there is a small fee to compete in that. In the past, they've had James Vandermark, Jeff Braditich, Diana Gannett, and many others as clinicians. Garneria House comes through each year, and Aaron always gives an extensive and in-depth Lutherie question and answer session, which is very cool. John says that one year someone asked what's on the inside of the bass exactly, and Aaron just popped the top off of one of his basses and showed everybody. And I will be sure to get details out about that when they become available. Jason Smith wrote in responding to something I sent out, I think in my newsletter, about a music-only podcast, or I'm not going to start a separate podcast, but maybe on a semi-regular basis, putting out music-only episodes. I have hours and hours and hours and hours of music that people have passed along my way, both from guests that I've had on and other people as well. And I'd love to find a way to put that out in some sort of organized fashion. So I was just mulling that over. And Jason Smith thinks that's a great idea. Also, Chris Betchel likes the idea as well. And he had some great thoughts. I'd love your feedback on this. I'll run this by you right here. And you can always send me an email, feedback@contrabassconversations.com, with your thoughts. So Chris says, I like the idea you've proposed of a weekly episode to showcase some music. This could be an extremely interesting installment to listen to, particularly if you did some talking and debriefing of the piece and performer either before or after. You could go into as much detail as you like program notes type of information about the performer and the piece would be obvious, but I think it'd be very interesting to hear you talk about some of the nerdier details of the process, of the pieces, such as interesting technical and musical considerations of the performer's part, memories of learning and playing them yourself if you have, things you might have done differently if you'd played it yourself, or when you've previously played it yourself, and so on. So that's a cool idea for sure. And he also says, I think the idea of having new music accompanied by discussion of that music could be educational and interesting to listen to. And that's a good idea. I haven't really done anything like that. And I can see something like that working. That's interesting food for thought for sure. I think I am going to try to, maybe I'll start it in September when the season or the academic year gets going for people. And if you have any thoughts on how a show like that would look, I'm not stopping these interview shows. I think that that's kind of the meat and potatoes of this podcast. So I'm going to keep doing like you heard today. But I do like the idea of featuring people. And some people, maybe it's not the right time or doesn't work to do one of these full-on feature episodes like what we did with Tom today, but maybe they've got a couple pieces that they want to share, or a composer that just wrote something, or that kind of thing, I think could be valuable. And there's really not an excellent outlet now. I mean, obviously you can put things on YouTube and that sort of thing, but there's a good following for this podcast. And I'd love to use this podcast as a way to get music out there too, as well as talking. Not that I don't love talking, obviously, as I sit here talking to you. And last thing before we close out here today, I'm getting such great feedback on the Winning the Audition series. And so thank you, those of you that have written in. I really appreciate it. And It's gotten a lot of listens, and I'm really happy with how that all came together. It was a big project, and I wasn't 100% sure how it would look, and it's the first of probably many like that. And my project right now is to take that, and I've actually finished this. I'm working on refining and buffing out the edges and that kind of thing, but I turned it into a book too, which I think has a separate kind of value besides the podcast form. It's what was said in the podcast and the quotes and everything, that's in the book, but I'm fleshing it out. I'm adding some material. I'm adding some diagrams and charts and resources and that kind of thing. And I don't know if a book is appropriate for everyone that I end up doing. They might or might not be. I don't know until I do another one. But I think that that's going to be a nice offering. I'm really excited about that. I finished the transcribing a few days ago. I'm just doing the layout and adding a couple extra features, and it's going to be a Kindle book. That's going to be an ebook you can get off of my website. That's going to be a print book too. So stay tuned for more details about that. And that's going to do it for another week of Contrabass Conversations. Thank you so much for hanging out with me on another episode. Thanks to Tom for being such a great guest, and we will see you again in a few days for more life on the low end of the spectrum.